Welcome to folks who are joining via the recording. We have skipped past the introductions and logistics phase and are onto the modeling section. So I will share my screen. So that we can all follow at home. Hopefully you now see the notes document. Can someone confirm that?
Looks good.
Okay, great, thank you. So as part of the American Art Collaborative and future, other discussions, there is a set of patterns that we found were pretty much ubiquitous when describing pretty much everything. So in order to try to be as consistent as possible and thus reduce the learning curve from everything being completely unique and special, we wanted to sort of go through these sort of baseline patterns first, because they apply to a lot of other aspects. So please feel free to jump in at any time and ask questions. This is not just a Rob talking. This is certainly discussion, because the reason for having these this working group and these calls is to ensure that both people understand what has happened, where we are today, but also to make sure that where we are today makes sense at all. If there are improvements, then we absolutely should be making them at this stage before we sort of set things in motion in terms of widespread implementation. So again, please do not hesitate to jump in, either if I'm not being clear or if you think there is some issue with what we're talking about, or for any other reason that you think is relevant and useful. So with that, there are of course a few core features of data that we use in Linked Art. Every resource has to have a URI, which we capture in ID in the JSON-LD representation. So if you come from the RDF world and haven't really seen much JSON-LD, this is the subject of the ID is not really a property, it's a magic term. In fact, very magic, it's just an alias for @ID, which is the subject of all of the other triples in. Then there is type. Type is also looks magic, but is really just RDF type, so the class of the resource. In this case, it is man-made object, which looks different in the JSON to how you might expect if you are from the CRM world. It expands to CRM E22 man-made object, but in order to make it a bit more friendly to JavaScript developers, or indeed developers in general, we've gotten rid of the namespace, we've gotten rid of the e-numbers, we've collapsed the hyphens and underscores and so on, down to something that looks a little bit more JSON-y, being sort of upper camel case string without any special characters. So now we have one triple. The ID is the subject, so linked art example object 14, RDF type, E22 man-made object. Can I make the screen text bigger? I certainly can. Is that better? Sorry, I have a big screen, but clearly if you were looking at it on a laptop, yeah, you would not have seen that well. Thank you for calling that out. So every resource, and this is the first sort of constraint that we've imposed. Every resource must have exactly one class. So linked data allows for resources that don't have an don't have any class. they just have properties, and you can infer one or more classes from those properties. It also allows for multiple classes, so multiple instantiation. We have made the sort of pragmatic decision that it must have exactly one class, because that is what will help developers to use the data in a consistent and usable sort of way. And then label is the last core property. So this is RDFS label, and the value is a string, which captures a human readable label for the object. And the label is intended for developers as opposed to for end users. So this is not a replacement for appellations or titles. This is something to make certain that everything with sort of an opaque URI and with the type at least has something that you can look at and say, here is, this is what this is if you know the data. So Dennis has asked, how do you deal with multiple instantiation? Which is a great question. So the way that we deal with it is to either not do it at all. Well, we don't do it at all, but we create or identify merge classes. So if, for example, there was an appellation that was translated, or a name that's translated, we would now be able to use the brand new E33, E41 linguistic appellation. And previously we had minted an extension class called name that was the merge of linguistic object and appellation. If there are other situations where that's needed, so far they haven't come up, but we'd approach it the same way and say, we'll make an extension class and try to petition the SIG to add it as a merge class if we can come up with sufficient rationale to allow it to a generally useful merge as opposed to a sort of very domain-specific one. Yeah, that is a good question, because it is in some paradigms sort of a core feature of RDF. So those are the sort of the three core properties that everything must have exactly one ID, must have exactly one type, and should have exactly one number. That means that all of these are just values, whereas if there was the possibility that they would have multiple values, so if you could have multiple labels, then even if there was one, it would be in a list. Antoine asks how this plays in a context where data could be served for different purposes and with different models. So yeah, we also have this this issue internally at the Getty for the vocabularies that have an existing SCOS linked open data deployment, and we want to add a linked art version of E55 types with appellations and so on. So we would use, and Antoine, you're implicated directly in this, a profile negotiation pattern where at request time you say, I want this as SCOS, or I want this as linked art. Assuming absolutely nothing, there is an existing mechanism, which is to put a URI for a profile into the profile parameter of the JSON-LD media type. But we hope that there'll be alignment in the data exchange on the web working group about how to make that consistent across different media types and so forth.
Can I jump in for a sec?
Of course.
I think one of the things that we're trying to balance here is that desire for this to function as a presentational API, a way to get access to the data, as well as a back-end a data store. And I think as many of us have played around with linked data know it doesn't always make sense to reveal at the API level or at the access level everything that you know about the data at the back end. And so for many less complicated things, those can be one-to-one. We've worked very hard to keep this at the point where it's reasonably comprehensive, but that's not a requirement to make your system work. It's just a requirement to make this API cross-compatible. And so using things like JSON-LD framing, you can frame it to be the properties that are linked art compatible, even if, say, you do have a triple store on the back that has a bunch of SCOS properties. The other reason we're using those merge classes is so that if we do use things like inferencing at the triple store inference logic level, we haven't lost any of the multiple instantiation work that you have, that you need to do that kind of work. We're just not exposing it to the API for the developers as JSON. Does that?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point. Thank you, David. So we to follow on from it briefly, it's also not that if there is data that isn't in the model that you can't say it, so long as it doesn't conflict with what we do say. So multiple instantiation, because we say you must have exactly one class. You couldn't do multiple instantiation in a linked art compatible way because implementations would fail when they saw a list rather than a string. However, if you had CRM inf and you wanted to express that it was believed that this was a man-made object, but someone else believed it was only a conceptual object and it never actually existed, we probably are not going to get to that level of sophistication in the model, but nothing prevents you from minting or from writing a context for CRM and adding that level of information in a sort of separate part of the API description off of one of these objects, as implementations will have to ignore things they don't understand. So long as it doesn't conflict with what we've specified, everything is good. Any further questions about this so far? Okay, so I'm going to jump over out of the baseline patterns over to titles and names, and I have an issue over in the issues here to move these into the baseline patterns. So we have this distinction between label and title. So or name, and the distinction being that, as I said before, label here, peasant and sheep, is intended for the developer, that if you see only these 3 bits of information, you at least know something about it, rather than just getting the URI, which is quite possibly a completely opaque UUID. However, of course, everything, very many things, very many resources that we care about have names, be that the title of a book, the title of an artwork, the name of an event, the name of a person, and so on and so forth. So in order to have a single class for names in general, we don't use, thankfully, we chose not to use all of the subclasses of appellation, seeing as in the previous SIG meeting, they all disappeared, they were all deprecated. And instead we use name. So name is now the newly added E33, E41 linguistic appellation, being the merge of linguistic object and appellation. Previously it was linked art name. So this guy is the primary name of this object, and it has the same content as the label, but it also tells you a lot more about it, such as it's a name, and not only is it just any old name, it's the primary name, which we have here AAT 300404670, which is primary term, or preferred terms. So that thus you know peasant and sheep is the preferred name, the preferred title for this man-made object. So this level is data, managed data. This is convenience for developers to know what they're looking at. For folks who have looked at this even up until last week, you may be surprised to see that name expands to the long E3341 class rather than LA name. And you may be even more surprised, if you didn't hover over it, to see content rather than value. So given that the SIG approved P190 has symbolic content, we no longer need to use RDF value, and hence to remain consistent with the ontology, we have swapped over to using content as opposed to value, which expands out to 190 as symbolic. We also hope that this is less confusing compared to label. So the label of this name would be name of object, and the content of the name is peasant and sheep. Similarly, previously we had both value for strings, for linguistic symbolic content, and for numeric content or numeric values in dimensions. Now that it has symbolic content, content, it's a bit clearer whether or not it's going to be a number, e.g. value, or it's going to be a string, e.g. P190 has symbolic content. Yes, and indeed. It's lovely to not have to talk through RDF value in all of the permutations. So indeed, thank you. Thank you, SIG, for hearing the concerns and acting on it. That, I think, is one of, to digress slightly, one of the advantages of doing this work in this way is we have both folks on the SIG, so myself, George, Thanasis, Thomas was here last week, and I think a couple of others are members of the SIG, but just because there's some folks who are on these calls, that doesn't in any way mean that the SIG will listen to what we have to say. However, when we are representing the work in general of many very well-established organizations, it becomes a much easier story to say, we are working with all of you guys, and we have agreed in this context that it would be nice if we could do this. Here are our use cases, and that story is much more convincing than a single person showing up to a meeting and pleading for a new property. So that is thus the two of the significant changes of very recently, and I think we certainly feel for the better. Are there any questions about that? Yep, Antoine, go ahead. And please, folks, feel free to just talk rather than typing, unless typing helps you to formulate the question, I guess.
Yeah, I'm not going to type these ones.
Yeah.
The first one is a clarification on label versus name.
Mm-hmm.
So am I right in guessing that the consequence of the levels of name/label imply that label will never have a language?
Yes, that is correct. Yep. Yeah. So one of the things that we got into discussing was, how do you have multiple labels? So peasant and sheep could be translated into, let me see if my French is up to it, paysan et mouton or something.
Yep.
However, then label stops meeting its purpose of being a quick, easy aid to someone to look at the data and see what it is. And it starts getting more complicated with either language maps in JSON-LD or RDF langstring plus language tags and other serializations. So we wanted to try and keep it separable such that the label is easy and the real data lives in name. Because it's linguistic appellation, it's necessarily got the ability to have a language, which this example does not, but I could find one pretty quickly, I hope. So then there would be two separate ways of saying exactly the same information, that peasant and sheep is English and paysan et mouton is en français. So we wanted to have as few ways of saying the same thing as possible.
And to talk through the other reason, which is why we have it at all, if you look at this example at the classified as, we talked for a long time about whether it made more sense to just have the bare URL there. So classified as vocab.edu/AAT long number. But what we've realized is that the computer is perfectly happy to deal with that, but at any point in which a human is trying to understand what this is, what this thing says, the constant dereferencing of those sort of URLs all over the place makes it really hard to understand these data models. And I think a lot of what we're trying to do here is optimize for that understanding linked data. And so we're willing to take a little bit more verbosity that's unnecessary to add in notes. And as you probably know, JSON does not have the ability for us to add comments, which would be another way to do this. But we really want to say, where do we put comment? And also, how do we interoperate well with linked data infrastructure that by default does things like display labels and make it easy for people to understand for using interfaces like Pubby or something like that in the RDF world.
Okay, so then that would lead me to my next question, which would be, are there some guidelines actually for humans, for the people who are creating the data, to pick the label when there are several names that would qualify as labels? I mean, to be really sure that the same object would consistently end with the same label.
I don't think we have. It would be back here if we do. No. So
could the label be different depending on the language that was used to make the request, or are we saying the label should always be consistent, and so, you know, choose a language or choose a language for each object? Or
yeah, I think those are the sort of API level questions that we have yet to delve into in any detail. Because yeah, indeed, if you had exactly this resource that I've got on the screen, you know, where there's only one bit of actual content that says example object, if you asked for that in French, example, exemplaire, objet, I can't do it as an adjective. Yes, anyway, I'm sure Antoine can, or you have an opinion on what the French of example object would be. Whether or not you wanted to do language-based content negotiation for labels, I think that is a great thing that we should discuss, and hence I'm writing it down. For the API level, for the model level, I'm not sure that it matters too much, but
well, if there needs to be only one, then if there are several potential candidates, then it would probably be good if we give guides on which one should be picked.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. I shall make issues for both of those, and we shall discuss them.
And I think this is a good example of places where input from people across the community are useful. We've certainly talked a long time about how best to do this and have very strong opinions, but our opinions are strong. What do you always say, Rob? strong opinions weakly held.
Yes. Yeah, meaning come down on something, but don't fight for it dogmatically if someone has a better idea. At least have an idea and put it down until such time as there's a better one. Antoine, did you have any further?
Yes, I think I had a couple, at least one, and that would help if I was seeing again this thing. Yeah, perfect. Again, to maybe reacting to what David said about trying to explain things to have things clear for developers. I'm wondering, is there also some indication about, and I mean, it's not so much a problem for me than something I sense could be a problem for others and the data consumers. Some clarification about the notion of type versus the notion of something classified as, because for many people that could be quite the same thing.
Yep. Yeah, and indeed, in CRM, it is P2 has type. So classified as is a very intentional renaming of that predicate away from its original label in the conceptual reference model to make that distinction.
Is it Dublin core type versus RDF type?
Essentially, yeah. That P2 has type, or classified as in our context, is a classification mechanism as a sort of bridge point out to external vocabularies, as opposed to a ontological hierarchy of subclasses. So RDF type, of course, or at type in JSON-LD, has a class subclass relationship, whereas this is essentially a set of tags that we're classifying this resource as. So this is a painting and an artwork, but we, in fact, if you look at these guys, artwork and painting are not directly related. Even though you might think painting would be a narrower term than work of art. Turns out in AAT, they're not. And we don't want to sort of be too restrictive about the sets of things that can go in here. I think and this is a discussion point, probably not for now, but the extent to which we as a group want to mandate you must use these core ones. So if it's an artwork, we've said to date, you must give it AAT 133025 so that people can distinguish a chair in a gallery from the Descartes 17th century French chair that you are not allowed to sit on because it's artwork, even if they're both also chairs. So yeah, classified as is sort of semantic tagging as opposed to class hierarchy.
And continuing on this, would there be somewhere some guidelines saying, or some constraints saying that never ever a class from a formal ontology should be used in a classified as?
If there
because
is
in a landscape where there's only one type allowed, it may be tempting to hijack this this field with a tempting name.
Yes, add a note, don't use RDF classes classified as. Yes, that would probably make all sorts of pain for many people, because the inference would be that the class is also an E55 type, which would then likely cause havoc.
I actually personally would be okay with it, but it's just that I'm used to this being raised as an issue sometimes, so I thought I would flag it.
And indeed, Antoine, we have now covered the next bullet on the agenda, which was types versus classifications.
Oh, cool!
So if you, as another set of examples, a man-made object is an art object, which is a painting. You can have a linguistic some linguistic content, which is a material statement. You can have an identifier that's an accession number, the organization, it's a museum, the place is a gallery, and so forth. And we don't want to have ontology level classes for all of these things, especially materials statements, because everyone has their own set of assessments that they make in text about resources. So having classified as the escape route to say, it's a painting, or it's a statue, or it's a painted statue, or it's a whatever you want. We don't then overload the simple structure of man-made object with that level of domain-specific detail.
And a lot of this is also to make sure that we as a group don't spend our entire life trying to define the set of properties that are relevant in our fields. We want to have a way to extend linked art using classifications from whatever domain-specific vocabulary makes sense to you without having to negotiate for shared properties. And so, for linguistic objects, we have a pattern to say, here's a block of text about a thing. What kind of block of text that is probably has interoperability points in many, many domains. You may end up with your own special ones that you don't ever want to discuss with anyone. And so this lets you extend the model in sort of a blessed way by adding many, many types to help clarify between things without requiring the sort of consensus for interoperability.
So to jump ahead, also being aware of the time, to talk through briefly that exact use case, here is another example. It is in the statements about a resource section of the base model page, and gives us the language thing. So here is the same example painting, and we have a text about it. It's a linguistic object. It has some content, the string oil on canvas, which could be parsed out as into structured data, that there is a part of the object which is oil and a part which is canvas, and that canvas part is the support. But if you haven't done that and you just want to record the fact that the curator said oil on canvas, we have the linguistic object with content, and it's then classified as a material statement, which would be AT3000100358. It is a brief text as opposed to a long work. It's not a document that describes this object, referred to by as the same property for long form monographs as well as 3-word assertions. So we want to be able to say, you should display this as a brief text. And what sort of brief text is it? It's a material statement. So this level is very much at the API. So find me all of the referred to bys that they're classified as brief texts. And then using this classification, you could say, and this is a material statement for the label, and the content of that statement is oil on canvas. Here we also have language, and again we use AAT rather than RDF lang strings to say this information, but really this resource has language of English, which has this identity. We tried very hard, and if you look at the GitHub issues, it goes backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards, to use developer convenient 2- and 3-letter names. But at the end of the day, there were 2 reasons to go this route. The first was not every language has a 2- or 3-letter ISO code, particularly indigenous languages. Australia has hundreds of indigenous languages which don't have ISO codes. And secondly, it's then also inconsistent with everything else. that if we're going to have sort of a very special hack to get EN to look like that somehow, then we've opened the door for the same thing for this guy and this guy and this guy and this guy and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, which would then essentially mean we were inconsistent. And while pure uniformity is not the aim, being as consistent as possible, or having as few exceptions as possible is the aim. So that's why we also thus went with appellation or E33, E41 as the separate object with language, rather than label having being a language map of EN, example painting on canvas, FR, peinture exemplaire sur, I don't know what canvas is, canvas.
But the Getty vocabularies won't have concepts for all the languages either.
It has all of the ISO ones because Patricia has imported them, and then some more. Conal, I hesitate to mispronounce the surname, but I believe it's Tu Hoi, who's Australian, identified another vocabulary called glottolog that is much more extensive. One of the things that I think we as a group should do is see if there's either crosswalk, or if we can simply pick one, or try to push the community towards alignment around this so that we can be confident in using a particular vocabulary. We've used AAT up until now just for consistency with all of the other ones. It's what we know, of course, but as David said, moving from the AAC, David and Rob ontology to the community, hopefully, supported, adopted, and implemented profile. All of these things are up for change.
Okay, if we can discuss this, it sounds good.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. I shall add an issue to discuss language vocabularies.
Can I ask at some point when you were referring to the brief text for something?
Cool.
It sounds like this is terminology that's commonly understood by developers. Then it happens to be kind of human readable, but and there must be other terms like this that developers look for in a code that says, brief text obviously is to be used in a specific use case, and maybe I don't know what the other kind of terms for developers are common, but maybe longer text or something like this,
Yep.
would point to other use cases. Is that true? Or okay.
Yep. Yeah. If it's a document, if it's so the case that came up for us was we have source documents that refer to the artwork, and we have statements such as oil on canvas that refer to the artwork, and you don't want to merge them all together in some presentation layer. You want to be able to say, here are all of the brief texts, and here's the bibliography. But without this distinction of brief versus non-brief texts, we couldn't do that. So again, using our privileged channel to Patricia, we explained the issue, and she added 418049 and I believe 418050 being not brief text or something like that, such that we can make the distinction.
And I think a lot of what we're, oh, go ahead.
Just to kind of summarize, if I understood, so those terms are commonly used in the developers community, but they were not in the AAT.
I don't even think they're commonly used in the developers community. I think what we're discovering as we work through this with practical examples is that in much of our data, there's implicit information, like in your collections management system that the text that goes into this field is constrained to 200 characters, and so it's always short. But in a interoperable world, there's no way to tell someone that implicit knowledge. And so I think a lot of what we've been doing is saying this is important information to convey, but it's implicit. And I think the question then becomes, do we as a community want to come up with a set of best practices to talk about brief text versus long text, or even artwork versus non-artwork that we can share across our organizations? Or is this the Getty cares about this distinction, and so we've put this tag into our data because it's a relevant piece of context, but it may not need to be ever used by anyone else.
So it's a really important point in the sense you're kind of trying to bring something new to this, to the way developers can handle data by giving them pointers. Am I completely off?
You're right.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the idea there might be if you were building like a browse app for linked data and you encountered something that had brief text, you would know that you could present it in a way that would be, consumable using some kind of brief text viewing thing, whether that's like like a UI element, like a pop-up or something, as opposed to like some really long research article that might require a different way of presenting it. Is that kind of the intention? And then something I encountered when I was looking at some of these is, so you have, I don't remember if type is ever type something else or not, because it just seems kind of redundant to have that in there on first glance. And then the other question was the label, I noticed, is not always like literally consistent with what the Getty terms are. And is it beneficial or intended that we as a community will agree on the label to use corresponding to each of these terms, or is it truly up to each implementation to choose their own label? I mean, I get the notion that this is supplemental because if a developer is looking at it, they're sort of clued into what it is. But at the same time, if they're just kind of coming into linked data, they might, they would probably almost certainly want to be cautioned to say, don't develop something that assumes that label is consistently applied across implementations, unless we're seeking to do that. And then related to that, it seems like if the Getty IDs had an alternative scheme that would include, nationality in the URL, you wouldn't even necessarily need the label as an additional piece of information there.
Yes. So indeed, there has not been any attempt to either ensure that label selection is consistent across implementations, because it's only there to make it clear what is happening and not be real in inverted commas data. Here is an example of when you might want to type a type. So if you have a person and they could be classified as being British, so they have the British tag. But if you wanted to then have that displayed to say nationality British, there are so many nationalities that you wouldn't be able to just make the list of all of these IDs are nationalities. So hence we want to be able to classify types or have types of types to say that this type is a nationality and the instance is, in this case, British nationality, such that when it's being consumed by by an application written by a developer who is a human who we care about, they don't have to figure out all of the possible nationalities. They just make a little widget that says, look for the classification of the person that has the classification nationality, and that's the nationality. If you then render the label, even though it's intended for the developer, what we would hope that they would do would be to look this up where there's all of the internationalized labels and so on, and display an appropriate one for their the audience.
So is type there? I mean, it in both of those nestings there. You have type. I mean, is that there just for compliance to be, you know,
yes,
compliant with some other spec? Okay, because it's just
it's always
okay. All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
You only classify things as types. So it is there to just ensure that every single resource has an RDF type, rather than to be essential. All right, it is past the top of the hour and people have had to disappear. So thank you, everyone. I will make the issues in GitHub for those things that have come up. If you can make it to the face-to-face, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Kevin, I will be in touch so we can organize the funding, and we will have a call again in 2 weeks' time. Thank you, everyone, and thanks,
Rob.
Emmanuel, for taking the notes.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Rob.
Bye now.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Thanks.